Done. Let's welcome our latest guest, Toby Harnden, to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
The man knows what to do on this show here.
Of course.
Well, your latest book, First Casualty, it's a nonfiction category, but it really taps into a lot of authors that we follow and admire. And so I just wanted to see if you could maybe give the audience a 30,000-foot view of what this book was all about.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's very much narrative nonfiction. It's not like a dry as dust sort of academic book, or, it's not about strategy, or that certainly, is the context for it. But it's really the story of, at the core, of 8 Americans, members of CIA's Team Alpha, who were the first Americans behind enemy lines after the 9/11 attacks in 2001. So they landed south of Mazar-i-Sharif in the mountains on October the 17th, 2001, in Black Hawk helicopters. They had no body armor, they had no helmets, they had $3 million in cash in non-sequential $100 bills. 4 of them were paramilitaries, 2 of them were case officers, traditional spies, linguists. One was a Green Beret and one was a medic. And they linked up with Abdul Rashid Dostum, who's a sort of classic warlord from Central Casting, who'd fought with the Soviets against the Mujahideen, who were backed by the CIA in the 1980s. And these 8 guys, exposed to incredible risk. One of them was Mike Spann, former Marine Corps officer, CIA paramilitary, who tragically was killed during an Al-Qaeda prison uprising on November the 25th, 2001. So, I mean, he paid the ultimate price, but every single day those guys were on the ground, and they were on the ground 40 days before Mike was killed, was incredibly dangerous. They helped the Afghans, the Northern Alliance, along with Green Berets, who came in 3 days after Team Alpha, to recapture Mazar-i-Sharif from the Taliban. That was the first domino to fall in 2001, and sort of heralded the end of the Taliban regime. Obviously, they returned, 20 years later. So it's a really a story of those guys and what they went through and what happened.
Right. For me, this was a highly complex book with a great amount of detail, every single page. So writing something of this scope and accuracy would take what looks to me like an unprecedented amount of research to thoroughly cover the opening of the war from so many different angles. So how much time did you estimate, or do you estimate, went into the research for this entire book?
It's sort of really hard to know. I mean, in a way, the research started on 9/11. I was in Washington, D.C. That day, walking into the office as the first plane hit the World Trade Center. I tried very hard to get to Afghanistan immediately. The Daily Telegraph editors quite rightly said, no, you stay where you are, cover the Bush administration and the war from that end. But I wrote a couple of stories about Mike Spann in that period. And his story sort of never left me. But then fast forward, a couple of years later, I was in Iraq, and somebody said, have you ever seen the video footage of the CIA officer who turned out to be David Tyson, running for his life in the Kalajangi fort in northern Afghanistan, just after Mike Spann had been killed? Yeah. I hadn't. I watched it, and I was just entranced by what David Tyson had been through, that sort of 1,000-yard stare.
Yeah,
he'd seen his comrade killed. He'd killed many Al-Qaeda getting out, and he still didn't know whether he was going to survive. And then I tracked him down in 2013, and in the way of these things, by that point, I was living in Northern Virginia, in McLean, where I still am. And David was living in Vienna, Virginia, which is kind of, the next town along.
Sure.
He was still at the CIA, so couldn't say very much. I did a few interviews at that point, and then put the sort of project to one side, as you do. But, over the years, I've been reading everything I could about Kalajangi, the Green Berets, the Horse Soldiers book, the 12 Strong movie, and all those events, the Gary Schroen's First In book, Gary Bernson's Jawbreaker book, Hank Crumpton's memoir, so all the sort of surrounding material. But the actual kind of full-time research and writing was really very compressed. It was probably 18 months from
Wow.
the end of 2019 to the end of 2019 to the middle of 2021, and I just hit it, and it was complete immersion. I went from, David Tyson just retired at the beginning of that period, so I started talking to David, and then I went from person to person and just pulled it all together. And I was at the end, we needed to hit the publishing deadline so we could get the book out on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And so I was reading and researching and pulling it all together, right up until the last minute. So it was pretty intensive.
Yeah. Well, speaking of David Tyson, I mean, this is an academic linguist who had just recently been recruited into the CIA because of his language and his knowledge of the area. He was truly one of the only few experts in this arena within the U.S. And he didn't have any military background. He had very little intelligence background at this point. But he's also willing to go in with the first team and one of the first people to step foot in country. So where do you think we would have been as an organization, the CIA organization? Where do you think they would have been, charging headlong into this environment without him? Because he seems so central to this early success.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting sort of question. So he did have some military background, but it was very limited. He'd spent a bit of time as an enlisted artilleryman.
Oh, that's right.
And a bit of time as an ROTC intelligence officer. But of the 8 of them, I mean, he was no elite warrior and never would pretend that he was. And yeah, I mean, the fascinating thing about David, who I've spent many, many hours with and who I count as a good friend at this point, was that he's a very, very sort of skilled linguist. I mean, he's almost fluent Uzbek. He'd lived for years in Central Asia. At one point, he was so close to going native, he didn't possess any shoes. He'd really, he was really into it. And the Afghans often joke that he was an Uzbek in another life. So he's a very clever guy, but at the same time, there's a real sort of everyman quality about him.
Yeah,
that he's, as you say, he's just this guy who sort of steps up along with some elite warriors, Green Beret, but he's not a very military sort of person, and he's just in this incredible, incredibly sort of hostile environment, fluid, something that very, very few people will experience. But he was put on the team late at the last minute when they got to Tashkent because of his Uzbek language, because Uzbek was the principal language of Dostum and Dostum's men. And the other linguist on the team was J.R. Seeger, who was a Dari linguist who had worked with the Mujahideen out of Islamabad CIA station in the 1980s. And I think those two, the linguistic and cultural knowledge and ability was absolutely crucial. Yeah. I mean, David with the Uzbeks, I mean, he was, there's a lot of, I mean, it's a tragic story in many ways, and there's lots of blood and guts and violence and all the rest of it. There's a lot of humor. Yeah. And David was central to that. He would joke with the Afghans about, why do you stand up when you piss, and why do we stand up when we piss and you sit down, and stuff about, there was a story about condoms getting flown in at one point, and there was lots of hilarity about that, vodka, and that kind of banter and joking and telling stories and playing tricks, everything. That was how he bonded with the Afghans and drew them in, and it became a very, very strong bond. Right. And so I think if David hadn't been there and J.R. Seeger hadn't been there, they would have been just operating blind. Right. And it would have been a completely different story. And of course, as you say, I mean, David was the only Uzbek speaker in the CIA at the time. None of the Green Berets spoke Uzbek or Dari or Pashto or any of the Afghan languages. I mean, some of them spoke Arabic and Russian. Right. But, I mean, I guess it was a feature of the whole US effort that, linguistic ability and cultural knowledge, was pretty sparse in the U.S. military. And a thing I feel about having studied this very early period, the early weeks, so closely, is that although there was kind of a formula for success, which was hundreds of Americans on the ground rather than 100,000, acting as advisors to the indigenous allies who were the resistance fighting the invaders, who were the Arabs of Al-Qaeda, and that was a formula that worked. There was also, this was Afghanistan. Lots of things went wrong. There was a lot of ambiguity. The whole prisoner uprising was a kind of a portent of things to come. And, David, for instance, there's a point of the book kind of really early on where he sort of realizes that even as one of the very few Americans who speak the language and understand the culture, he just sort of realizes it would take him several lifetimes to be able to understand this place. And that's him. So what's it like for the rest of the Americans? Yeah. So I thought that was a sort of fascinating realization that he had very early on.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, that's one of the challenges we face. And I think the book does a great job of sort of setting forth the situation, setting the table for what it was like when we came in and why we had successes and why we had failures. At the outset of the conflict, though, the U.S. administration, particularly Secretary Rumsfeld, had very little knowledge of the true nature of the region, even when it came to basic challenges like the terrain and the weather and how that would impact the first teams looking to insert into their areas of operation. Can you assess, after looking at this, as closely as you have, how much the scarcity of intelligence in those simple regards impacted the early operations by the initial teams?
Yeah, it was an incredible situation, really. So on 9/11, and this is very much a 9/11 book, it starts on 9/11 with sort of three of the principal characters. David Tyson's flying to from Tashkent to Heathrow for a meeting about Stinger missiles at the CIA station in London. Justin Sapp, who's the Green Beret, he's underwater at Special Forces Dive School in Key West, Florida. And then Mike Spann is inside CIA headquarters, Special Activities Division, when the events of 9/11 are unfolding. And and immediately the sort of the man of the hour is Kofa Black, who's the counterterrorism center director, who's an old Africa division hand, who was a sort of storied case officer that was once sort of targeted for capture or assassination by bin Laden. And he and his team, including Alex Station, which was the bin Laden unit within the counterterrorism center, had been monitoring and sounding the alarm about Al-Qaeda for years. And there'd been embassy bombings in East Africa in 1998. There'd been the attack on the USS Cole in October 2000. There'd been the Millennium Plot. And the CTC and Kofa Black and the people who work for him have been saying, like, they are coming here. During this period of sort of 2 years or so before 9/11, David Tyson was one of them. A number of CIA officers had been flying into the Panjshir Valley via Dushanbe in Tajikistan, usually, to link up with the Northern Alliance. And they had sort of formulated the outlines of a plan which became known as the Blue Sky Memo, which was about how to use the Northern Alliance to get at Al-Qaeda, who were being hosted by the Taliban. Neither the Bush administration nor the Clinton administration had the sort of political will to go through with it. But on 9/11, all of a sudden everything changes, and Bush wants to do it. And Kofa Black sort of pitches a plan in this sort of very sort of theatrical manner, but there's me flies walking across their eyeballs when we finished. And it fits the mood of the nation and the mood of the president. Remarkably, the Pentagon had no plan. I thought they had plans for everything, including, invading Mexico or Canada, but apparently no Afghanistan plan. And, as I mentioned, no linguistic expertise amongst the Green Berets who've been preparing for other conflicts. And so the CIA is doing it. And, they had some intelligence, small numbers of people who'd never lost sight of what was happening in Afghanistan, but not very much, because essentially the US government had abandoned Afghanistan when the Soviets left in 1989, because it seemed to be no longer relevant. It was a Cold War conflict. And so, the principles of action were there. There was limited expertise, as discussed, for people like David and JR and a few others, Gary Schroen, who led the Jawbreaker team, but it was pretty thin on the ground. And so you could argue that that makes the success in those early weeks and months even more remarkable, because it wasn't even on the back of an envelope. It was just like, go there, and
figure it out,
get on the ground and work it out.
Yeah. Man, that's significant.
Well, you mentioned earlier, you mentioned Abdul Rashid, Dostum. One of the biggest challenges, and I know you interviewed him for the book, I believe. Yeah, awesome. That had to be somewhat chilling, I would think.
It was an experience, definitely.
Well, one of the greatest challenges that we faced was dealing with the competing warlords who controlled the different regions of the country. We had to find a way to, work with all of them to take back the regions that were controlled by the Taliban. And I know it at least from the outsider's purview and just kind of reading some of what you've written, it seemed that the administration thought they'd just come in and buy allegiances with bags of cash and equipment. But can you talk to our audience a little bit about the complexities of this situation, from the different motivations of the groups and the tribalism that led to many complications for the U.S. mission?
Yeah, certainly that was one of the fascinating things. Yes, they did take in cash. I think I said $3 million, and they had another $3 million pretty soon afterwards. And certainly weapons and the sort of awesome might of US air power overhead, which changed the military equation. They were very, very important. But the CIA was in there to manage the tribes and gather intelligence on Al-Qaeda. And when Team Alpha landed, there was Dostum, but nominally a subordinate and an ally, but really a rival and potential enemy was Atta Mohammed Noor, who was a Tajik commander in the area. And Atta wanted to be the main man, but the agency saw Dostum as being the main man, and he had more troops and he had more of a proven record as a fighter. But when Team Alpha landed, Atta, his nose was out of joint. He wouldn't go and meet the CIA, even though he was very, very close. And there was all this sort of gamesmanship where J.R. Seeger wore a Pakol hat, which is sort of a Pashtun hat, and then Atta was correcting him on the way he wore it, and Atta was criticizing J.R. Seeger's diary as not being adequate enough, and Atta was speaking in this very sort of flowery sort of version of the Persian language. It was just sort of gamesmanship, and JR had to work out how to get Atta on board and basically stop him attacking Dostum and potentially killing Americans in the process.
Right.
And so they had to get these two rivals literally pointing in the same direction, which was north towards Mazar-e Sharif, and that took a lot of work. So Team Alpha was 8, but it kept on breaking up into 3s and even 2s sometimes.
Yeah.
So 3 of Team Alpha went on a 13-hour horse ride. It was absolutely excruciating. David Tyson sort of still, I think, feels the pain 20 years on, to link up with Atta and basically tell him that, yes, he was going to get an ODA, it's a 12-man Green Beret team, as well as Dostum, and a CIA team, which was Team Bravo, which was three people, 3 CIA officers, plus one of Team Alpha. Scott Spellmeyer was sort of stayed behind to command Team Bravo. And of course, the cash and the supplies. And then Atta was happy. and he fought alongside Dostum and helped recapture Mazar-e-Sharif. That was that did not happen by accident, and it was successful, but it there was no guarantee of success. And that was something I knew nothing about before I did the research for this book, and it was an incredible thing to be able to pull off.
Yeah, and I'm holding my breath the whole time reading this because I'm watching everything unfold, and I'm just picturing just one simple error that the guys have in terms of their communications or their discussions that could unravel the entire thing.
Yeah,
so it was amazing that it actually followed through in any sense. Your book really takes us up to the pivotal moment, with the uprising at the prison where Mike's killed and David's fighting for his life. After interviewing most of the people involved everybody involved that you spoke with, did you see any shifts, or did you sense that there were any shifts in the country, like the U.S.'s outlook or attitude after this pivotal moment happens?
Yes. I think it's sort of, there's a tragic sort of irony about this. So Rumsfeld and the Pentagon in particular were sort of voices of doom. The CIA was leading the war, and they were predicting that they were going to get the American forces will get bogged down for the winter. We'll be fighting through to the spring of 2002, and they wouldn't be able to sort of dislodge the Taliban, and there would be sort of a Vietnam-style quagmire. Now, of course, there subsequently was, but that's just a different story. But Mazar-e-Sharif fell November the 10th, 2001. So less than a month after Team Alpha and the first Green Berets got there. But at that point, in classic sort of Afghan fashion, a lot of the Taliban were not killed or captured. They just sort of went home, went to their villages, melted away into Pakistan to sort of reconstitute themselves. And there was, but in the US, there was a sense of it's over.
Right.
Mazar-e-Sharif has fallen. Now, of course, the uprising was part of a sort of Trojan horse plot to retake Mazar-e-Sharif, quite a sophisticated plot. Yeah. But I think back in Washington, the uprising was quelled after 6 days. Mike Spann was killed tragically. There was a friendly fire incident with a 2,000-pound JDAM being dropped on a friendly position that killed a number of Afghan allies, wounded 5 Americans and a couple of Brits. But in a way, I think it was sort of brushed to one side, and the indications, the things that people like J.R. Seeger and David Tyson were saying were ignored, and instead the policymakers decided, well, this is easy. We just topple a regime. We'll build. Having said that, the US wasn't in the nation building business. Let's build a centralized democracy in Afghanistan. Let's go on, change another regime in Iraq.
Right.
We can do it. We're Americans. We can do.
We've done it a number of
anything.
times before. Yeah.
And of course, so I think the moment it changed was really the start of December 2001, where the conference at Bonn was deciding on the new Afghan government. A lot of the Dostum was marginalized at that point. Oh, he's a warlord. He's got blood on his hands. Well, who in Afghanistan who's successful doesn't have blood on his hands?
The only people do are living.
Right, exactly. And also Karzai, who was the chosen leader of Afghanistan and was very sort of acceptable to spoke good English, and he's kind of refined and
presentable.
He very much exactly the opposite of Dostum, really, who's at this point persona non grata. Karzai was saying, he was proposing that some elements of the sort of small elements of the defeated Taliban should be incorporated into the new Afghan government, which would be, in accordance with Afghan tradition. And, Rumsfeld and the Bush administration were like, no, with us or against us, they're terrorists, absolutely no way. And it's kind of like hubris, because, 20 years later, we're essentially or less than 20 years later, we're essentially surrendering to them, in negotiations. And rather than having some kind of negotiations from a position of great strength and kind of neutralizing the Taliban. Now, I'm not suggesting any of this, would have been easy, but you can see how the thing kind of turns, in the wake of this, stunning kind of victory right at the start of December 2001. And looking back at it from this vantage point and the events of the last 20 years, and particularly the collapse in the summer, it's pretty tragic.
Yeah.
Well, we paralleled the same mistake in Iraq, where we took the military and, all those people, and we wouldn't let them back in right away. And it was almost exactly the same mistake in a different situation.
Well, it's American hubris, really.
Yeah.
So there are casualties beyond just Mike's, death. He had an infant son at the time that he left. Shannon was in the CIA and behind with them, and he had 2 daughters that were still quite young. Do you think that your book, First Casualty, helped them in any sense, maybe gain a little bit more understanding of their father or the situation that he was involved in? Have you gotten any sense of any kind of feedback from the kids?
Yeah, well, I hope so. I mean, I was just texting with Jake Spann the other day, who was a baby. He was 6 months old when his father died. And, the heartbreaking photographs of him being held by his grandfather at the funeral, December 10th, 2001. He wrote a very, I felt, quite poignant piece that was posted on the Fox News website about, what it's like to grow up with this father that you never knew.
Right.
I spoke extensively. I spoke to both Mike's parents, Johnny and Gail Spann, in Winfield, Alabama. I interviewed Shannon Spann extensively. She's since remarried, another CIA officer, had another child, left the CIA, is now living in Michigan. Mm-hmm. But it was, utterly tragic. Any death obviously is.
Yeah, sure.
But Mike died. He was newly remarried. He had a new baby. He had been with Shannon for not much more than 18 months or so. She wasn't fully incorporated into the Spann family. He was, the glue that held it all together. Yeah. And in time, that sort of blended arrangement, would have grown and strengthened. Also, Mike's first wife, so the mother of his 2 daughters, was terminally ill with cancer, and died at the end of 2001. Ugh. And so, how much can you throw at sort of one family?
Yeah.
And Shannon, reflects on, she's now suffers from rheumatoid arthritis. She's a very sort of strong woman. She's working day and night on getting Afghan allies out of the country, but she's very frank about it, which, I sort of cover in the book, that, she paid a price, and her kind of MO at the time was just press on. Let's just sort of soldier on and work it out.
Yeah.
But, but that catches up with you eventually. And so she's very, reflective, about her experience over the last 20 years, as is in a different way David Tyson, who's had to cope with survivor's guilt, the sort of trauma of what he saw and what he did. And I think both of them, in different ways, decided that, you honor Mike Spann by living a good and successful and meaningful life, which, obviously there's another route that people can take so in this. And so
that's right.
It was very hard. It's very hard writing about this stuff, intimate details of families and divorce and tragedy, and people cope with grief in very, very different ways.
Right.
And so I hope, that to members of the one of the very gratifying things members of the team have said to me is that they were able to sort of learn the bigger picture and put their experience in the context of what everybody else was doing, and kind of learn from the book, which is incredible that they were there and I wasn't.
Sure.
And so I do hope that members of the family will learn more about their father, Team Alpha's mission, America's sort of mission in that period, because I'm very conscious that I'm just an outsider dealing with these profound, intimate details of people's lives.
Right.
Well, there's something very fitting about the timing of this book, in the sense that the war ended, or we left, and this is all about the beginning and the roots of it. So I think it's a really good time to sort of reflect on the beginning of it. And obviously, with the recent withdrawal and after 20 years of war, brings out a lot of emotion, a lot of opinions and feelings on how it was conducted. And those difference of views are exacerbated by how polarized we are as a nation right now.
Yeah.
But you spoke with a lot of people. Did you find any common threads from those you spoke with about what the U.S. maybe should have done to assist in a more stable exit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm still speaking to, Team Alpha members and others involved in this sort of almost daily.
Yeah.
And I've been, playing a small part in helping Afghans get out. And in fact, the translator that I worked with last year in Mazar-e Sharif is now living in my house. And in fact, I'm sitting here in my office, but he's sleep. His bed is in my office at the moment as well.
That's amazing.
He's not in it, but and that was this network. Shannon, David, Justin Sapp, Scott Spellmeyer. They're all part of this effort to get Afghans out. And so their emotions are sort of, mourning, anger, sadness, all those things, and they are channeling those feelings into helping Afghans and getting, banding together and getting something done, which is very much the team.
God bless them.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the spirit of Team Alpha from 2001, which is, there's no sort of blueprint for this. We're stepping into the unknown, and we're going to cut through all the bureaucracy, and we're just going to do it. But yeah, I mean, certainly, I'm not going to speak for any individual members of Team Alpha, obviously, but there's a general consensus that the withdrawal was catastrophic and mismanaged, and in many ways shameful. And I mean, they feel in general that the Afghan allies were sort of let down by the American government, and the people who sort of stepped up, largely, through their own interests, because they wanted their country back as well, to fight alongside the Americans in 2001. We abandoned them, and there's certainly a feeling of that. And in terms of what we should have done over the last 20 years, I mean, there is a sense that the formula that was sort of hit upon in this sort of improvised way in 2001 worked. Small numbers of Americans, working in the wings alongside the Afghans, but it's an Afghan fight. It's not an American fight. That if we'd stuck with that, no one's pretending it would have been easy, but instead of doing the big, USA Inc., big army bases,
right,
100,000 troops and all that, it could have been very different. And certainly there's my personal view, and I think this is shared by most of the people who are involved in this sort of early effort, is that we should have left a residual force of some size, and to just close Bagram and cut off the sort of logistical kind of lifeline to these forces, and then turn around and blame them for not fighting,
right,
was a pretty terrible thing to do. And so that's but it is what it is, and we just get on with helping the Afghans that we can,
right,
and hope and sort of advocate for not abandoning Afghanistan as a country as we did in 1989, because, you know, we know what happens when, you know, we leave a regime like the Taliban, you know, to control sort of ungoverned space in terms of the US, with Al-Qaeda still there and ISIS-K and goodness knows who else.
Well, we'll see them again on our soil, I'm sure. Yeah, and I think I don't know anybody that thought leaving Bagram and all the prisoners that were being held there just being released out into the countryside was a very good idea. But, you know, that's politics, I guess.
Right.
If there's one message that you want your book to reach the American public, do you have something in mind?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned how divided the country is now.
Yeah.
And I was in Washington, D.C. on 9/11, and I vividly remember how united we were. Bush's popularity rating was 90%, I think, in October 2001. One member of Congress, Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California, voted against authorizing military force. I mean, in terms of the sort of global community, NATO invoked Article 5, the UN backed us. Everybody was in, you know, everybody was behind this. You know, we need to go in and get the people who perpetrated 9/11 and stop another attack happening.
Right.
And I remember thinking at the time, like, this can't last, you know, Bush on the bullhorn in New York, and, you know, and of course that's just a sort of a moment.
Yeah, sure.
But, you know, you contrast that with where we are now, and just sort of viciousness and people getting cancelled every 10 minutes for off-color things they said 10 years ago, or, you know, the lowest common denominator, you know, everybody leaping on tweets and just arguing about stupid stuff, and in their sort of camps of, you know, putting the worst possible complexion on the motives of the other side. And it's very easy to get depressed about that.
Yeah.
So sort of two things. So the first thing is I want that, you know, I would like the takeaway, and it's my takeaway really, is that human beings, and particularly Americans, can do incredible things when we put our mind to it.
Yeah.
So these 8 guys in Team Alpha being an example of, can go into Afghanistan, you know, and to be eager, if not desperate, to get in there, and basically saying, like Mike Spann, who had every reason not to go,
right,
not only am I okay with going, but send me. I want to go. I want to be at the tip of the spear, and look at what they did. And then if you fast forward to now, I feel that the effort to get Afghans out of the country is one of those things where, I don't know, I feel that maybe there's polling to back this up or not, but 80% of Americans are to some degree sort of behind that. It's something we can agree on, whether you were for the war or against the war. You should have, you know, we should have kept more troops in. We should have had them leave. Whatever your views are, we can all agree that these are people who need our help. The Taliban's, you know, terrible regime, who are going to do God knows what to allies of America who are left behind. And so, and also, as I sort of mentioned, there are people, individuals from Team Alpha, other current former CIA people, US government people, military, former military, just good-hearted people, you know, entrepreneurs, business people who are involved in getting Afghans out. You know, I think arguably, you know, in my view, filling of the vacuum left by our own government.
Right.
And that to me is inspiring. It shows that despite us being very divided in many ways, and much more divided than we were 20 years ago, we can do things. And so I find that sort of a cause for optimism about the future, because it's very easy to get depressed about a lot of things.
Right. And then just follow into the footsteps of everybody else doing the same thing. Yeah.
Well, Mike asked a philosophical question. I guess mine's slightly more mechanical. So unfortunately, we always seem to be one generation away from another war somewhere in the world. With all the lessons found inside First Casualty, despite that, it seems like we're still destined to repeat the same mistakes, and maybe even worse ones as we go forward. My question is, and I think about this a lot, how do we build an institutional memory that spans administrations, so that there are enough people around that say, wait, I've seen this movie before, and we do not want to go about it this way?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a great question. I mean, part of the greatness of America, I think, is the sort of the vibrancy in we're new. I mean, I look around, you know, there's houses being torn down and new houses being built in a way that certainly didn't happen in the country where I grew up. And there's always, there's this kind of, but that can lead us to sort of dismissing the past. So, you know, I hope that people read books, like including this one. I hope that, you know, people talk about, you know, the deep state and all the rest of it. But, you know, there was a cohort of people in the CIA who never lost sight of Afghanistan, who, you know, who basically stayed on that issue, knowing or believing that one day it will be relevant again. And they do that every day in lots of different parts of the world. A bit like, you know, the BBC may have a correspondent in some remote country that nobody cares about, but suddenly something happens and that's their moment, and that investment in expertise pays dividends. So, you know, I hope that there are people in government who, you know, who are away from the cable TV and the talking points, who are saying, you know, we've got to get this stuff right. We've got to learn from our mistakes. We've got to learn from our successes. And we've got to keep a sort of a brains trust of people like, I don't know, inside government, but also outside governments, you know, think tanks, of people who, you know, in a sort of era where there's a lot of stuff that's dumb, where we can have sort of depth and nuance and expertise. I mean, I think an investment in
nuance. That's
nuance.
That's a novel freaking concept.
Yeah.
Right. You know, an investment in languages and cultural expertise. You know, we can but hope. You know, but it's you know, I mean, I'm sure people said this after Vietnam as well. So
Yeah, that's what we're worried about. Well, Toby, you have survived the traditional portion of our interview. Now we enter what's called the lightning round. And for those
Okay.
I'm going to pitch this at the end, but buy this damn book.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All right, let's find out more.
I'm going to show it as well.
That's right. Let's find
And
out
I think
more
there's
about.
copies behind me as well. So no excuse not to buy it.
That's right. And now it's time for you to grab a drink, because here we're going to try and find out a little more about our author spotlighted today. So there are no right or wrong answers. There are just answers. And so number one, if you had been inserted into the alpha teams right off the get-go, and one of the Afghan commanders had maybe issued you a horse for travel, what would its name have been?
I think I would have called it Gumbo.
Gumbo.
Because that was the name of my childhood dog and a beloved pet who was always good to me. So I hope the horse would have behaved the same way.
Drink to Gumbo there. All right. Now, if you had one personal item that you had been able to take with you during this mission, what do you think you would have taken with you?
A baby wipe, or a pack of baby wipes.
I'm saying you need more than one.
Some Charmin, yeah.
I mean, as a correspondent, I would always buy baby wipes. You know, can't have a shower. You know, the next best thing is a few baby wipes. Dust gets everywhere. It gives some sense of sanitation. There's obviously issues with going to the bathroom and stuff. So yeah, you can't go wrong with a pack of baby wipes.
Baby wipes it is. Might have been worth millions of dollars. All right. My last question is this. How many current government officials did you royally piss off writing First Casualty?
I don't know. I mean, I pissed off a lot with Dead Mannerism, my second book, which ended up getting bought by the Ministry of Defense and the entire first print run being pulped.
You must have hit a nerve.
Right. So far, I don't know. I'd imagine there might be some people at the Pentagon who are particularly happy. I mean, I interviewed Donald Rumsfeld a number of times. Obviously, he died recently, and he was a little bit too far into his dotage to interview, but he probably doesn't come out particularly well. So I don't know, but I haven't had any, fires set outside my house, or
no effigies or anything.
No, or even like, calls with the line going dead in the middle of the night. So
sure.
Touch wood, I think I'm okay. I'm pretty close. I'm pretty close. I live pretty close to the CIA, and so far I haven't detected any clandestine operations to
hiding in plain sight. Maybe
take me out. Yeah,
that's right. All right, Shawnee.
Okay. Well, you served as an exchange officer in the Royal Norwegian Navy.
Oh,
and unless I was drunk and read this incorrectly, you helped transport reindeer on a troop landing craft?
That's right. Well, this is something I don't think I've ever spoken about outside, the family.
That's why you're here.
That's true. So that was in 1987. So I was an officer in the Royal Navy. I was still at university at the time. I was sponsored through degree course at Oxford, studying modern history. And I had a month's exchange with the Royal Norwegian Navy, which was great fun. And we zipped around on board fast patrol boats in and out of the fjords. And one of the duties, as you correctly say, was moving reindeer on these little landing craft from their summer pastures to their winter pastures. So I think they were on islands and we were taking them to the mainland. But yeah, we'd herd these reindeer onto the troop ships and pull up the back gate and move them. So, I mean, it wasn't exactly a frontline, Team Alpha style mission, but it was fun, and it was something different.
Sounds like a recruiting.
And for our viewers under 10, they weren't the magic Santas.
Yeah, it wasn't Santas. Yeah, they're
right.
Okay, my second question: you reported from 33 countries while reporting for the Daily Telegraph and Sunday Times. If my research is correct.
Yeah.
Which of those countries had the best cuisine?
Best cuisine.
Don't say England.
No, definitely not England. I would say Lebanon.
No kidding.
Yeah, so I love Lebanese food.
So do I.
This sort of blend of, Middle Eastern, but with sort of, French influence and Mediterranean influence.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty nice. Now, one of the things about me is I'll eat anything. And so, I actually quite liked MREs,
Okay.
So that shows you.
That makes one of you.
Right. That shows the sort of standard. So I'm very happy with pretty basic food, but I do love really good food. I was in prison in Zimbabwe in 2005, a whole other story. And this wasn't the national cuisine, but we had lawyers and a couple of diplomats from the British embassy there who bring us in bacon and avocado sandwiches when we were in prison. Okay. Those tasted pretty nice.
Yeah, I bet.
So that's right up there with Lebanese cuisine.
Nice.
But I will eat anything, so I'm not fussy.
All right, my third question. So you are our third Brit that we've had as a guest and our second graduate of Oxford University. So my question revolves around Oxford. Which is the greatest film to feature or be set at Oxford University? Is it 1984's Oxford Blues featuring Rob Lowe, or 2003's What a Girl Wants featuring Amanda Bynes?
Okay, so I will go for A.
Okay.
Mainly because I haven't seen the other movie, but also because I was at Oxford when
I was going to ask you
were happening. So the boat race mutiny, and it was portrayed. I don't know how accurate it was as sort of the American, these Americans from Dartmouth coming in and kind of taking over this hallowed institution. And so Yes, definitely A, because it sort of just reminds me of the time there. And I did row at Oxford.
Oh, wow. Didn't know
to
that.
a very, very low standard because I was at a very small college, the sort of smallest fully fledged college, Corpus Christi. So we were always like in Division 3. And so all these, Oriel and Christchurch and University College that supplied guys who rowed in the boat race were sort of just literally in a different league to us. But, it was a fun thing to do at college.
Nice.
Well, I have a bonus question. It's an obligatory question since you're English. Who was the greatest Beatle and why is it Paul McCartney?
Definitely not Paul McCartney. I think George Harrison was pretty cool. Or John Lennon.
George Harrison is damn cool.
But yeah. Or Ringo, but definitely not
Paul McCartney's the greatest Beatle.
And here we go again. Hey, everybody, we loved this book. It was First Casualty. This really kind of explains the early parts of the war for a lot of folks who have forgotten it over the years. This really goes into grand detail about really the early successes and how we kind of lost our way, and really speaks to a select few in our country who went in harm's way right off the get-go in austere conditions, and really were the best of us at that time. So Toby, this was a fantastic book. It was so full of detail and I just soaked it all up. It was fantastic. And I learned a ton, and I hope everybody else goes out and buys this and
it's canon.
Yeah.
It's canon now for Gulf War history. This is canon.
So. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. And thanks, Sean. I really appreciate that.
Yeah. Cheers to you, sir.
Cheers.
All right. Shawnee boy, we had Toby in the show, and his latest book, First Casualty. Man, chock full of info and some, firsthand accounts. He doesn't get into the politics of, sides versus sides. He really just delves down into what actually occurred, which is quite refreshing in these times. And we're going to toast out Chris, who could not be here today. And I know he would want to talk to Toby because this is right up his alley. So, but anyway, folks, Sean and I say it, get this book. It really goes to the heart of the matter and where things began in an excellent way. And it really honors the people that were involved. And I was grateful to see that style of writing for this book. So
me too. And if you're a teacher, if you teach anything that has to do with recent history, this is something you should be assigned.
This should be must reading for military academies as well. So I will definitely throw that out there. So cheers to Sean. Chris, we love you, buddy. And we'll see you soon. Mm.